There was a cheesecake bar that lived in the back of the refrigerator, wrapped in foil, with a ribbon of strawberry jam running straight through its center like a secret. It was cold and dense and sweet in a way no cookie or candy bar could touch. A real dessert disguised as a snack, hiding behind the milk carton so nobody's little brother would eat the last one first. By the early 2000s, that foil-wrapped tray sat in refrigerated cases in supermarkets across the country. Parents packed it into lunchboxes. Kids peeled it open after school without asking permission. It tasted like something a bakery made, not a factory. Then, sometime around 2004, the tray stopped showing up. No announcement, no goodbye, just an empty spot where it used to be. Why would a company quietly pull a dessert that people were begging to keep? And what really happened behind the walls of the plant that made it? A mystery that, 20 years later, fans are still trying to solve. Inside the Philadelphia cream cheese division of Kraft Foods, sometime in the late 1990s, a small team of food developers was chasing an idea that sounded almost too simple to work. What if cheesecake didn't need a fork, a plate, or an oven at all? Cheesecake had always been a special occasion dessert, something sliced at a birthday party or bought whole from a bakery counter, wrapped in plastic, meant to be shared and eaten slowly with company. Kraft's cream cheese business had spent decades building trust with American kitchens through the little foil-wrapped brick in the dairy aisle. The question the developers kept returning to was whether that trust could be stretched into something new. A version of cheesecake built for one person, eaten standing up, kept cold in a refrigerator door instead of a bakery case. The market gap was clear enough. Snack aisles in the late 1990s were full of packaged cookies, granola bars, and cake mix desserts that lived at room temperature and lasted for months. But nothing occupied the middle ground between an indulgent, bakery-style dessert and a grab-and-go snack. Kraft's team believed there was room in the refrigerated case, right next to the yogurt and the string cheese, for something that felt like a real treat rather than a processed substitute for one. What made the product different wasn't just the shape, it was the structure. Rather than a simple slab of sweetened cream cheese, the developers built each bar in layers. A pressed graham cracker crust on the bottom, a rich cream cheese filling on top, and, in the flavor that would become the most beloved of the entire line, a groove carved down the center and filled with strawberry jam, finished with a drizzle of white chocolate. It was a construction choice that mattered enormously to the people who grew up eating it. The fruit wasn't mixed in or swirled through. It ran down the middle like a seam, so that every single bite carried crust, cream, and fruit together in the same proportion the last bite did. Production began in 1979, and the bars were sold refrigerated in trays of individually wrapped pieces, positioned in the dairy case rather than the cookie aisle. A distribution decision that shaped everything about how people encountered the product. Shoppers weren't browsing for it among candy and crackers. They found it by accident, next to the milk, which gave it an air of being something more substantial, more like real food than a typical snack cake. The belief driving the whole project was straightforward. People didn't actually want a diet substitute or a shelf-stable imitation of dessert. They wanted the real thing, just smaller, colder, and easier to eat without ceremony. Whoever inside Kraft first tasted a finished bar and greenlit it for national production was betting that American shoppers would treat a cheesecake bar the same way they treated a yogurt cup. Something you grabbed without thinking twice, but that still tasted like it had been made with care. That bet paid off faster than almost anyone at Kraft expected. Within a year or two of its debut, the Strawberry Cheesecake Bar wasn't just selling. It was becoming a fixture in refrigerators across the country. The kind of product a family bought every single week without discussing it. The bars were about to enter the golden years of their life on the shelf. But golden years, as anyone who has watched a favorite product disappear already knows, are never as permanent as they feel while you're living inside them. By the early 2000s, the Strawberry Cheesecake Bar had claimed a permanent spot in the refrigerated case of nearly every major grocery chain in the country. Kroger, Safeway, Winn-Dixie, A&P, tucked between the yogurt cups and the string cheese, a stretch of cold shelf that had once belonged only to breakfast and lunch staples. Finding it there, among the ordinary dairy items, was part of what made it feel special. It wasn't hiding behind a candy bar wrapper or stacked in a checkout lane bin designed to catch a child's eye. It was sitting quietly in the same aisle as milk and eggs, waiting to be noticed by anyone who actually looked. For the families who bought it, the bar had its own rhythm. It showed up in the cart on the weekly grocery run, right alongside the staples nobody thought twice about restocking. It went into lunch boxes on Monday morning and was usually gone by Wednesday. It got pulled out of the fridge after dinner, foil peeled back in one motion, and eaten standing at the kitchen counter because waiting for a plate felt like an unnecessary delay. Unlike a whole cheesecake, which required a special occasion to justify slicing into it, the bar asked for nothing. It didn't need a birthday or a holiday. It only needed a refrigerator and 5 free minutes. The packaging itself became part of the ritual. Each bar was wrapped individually in foil, sealed inside a plastic tray, and the tray itself sat inside a printed box that promised something richer than a typical snack. A photograph of the bar cut open, the strawberry seam glistening down the center, the white chocolate drizzle catching the light. Opening that foil was almost theatrical in its own small way. The crinkle of it, the slight resistance before the wrapper gave, and then the bar itself, cold and dense, with the crumb of the graham crust giving way to the tang of the cream cheese and the sweetness of the jam running through the middle. On Reddit's ear nostalgia and in comment sections scattered across food blogs and TikTok, the same memories surface again and again, told by different people who never met each other, but somehow lived the same experience. One person recalled hiding the box behind the milk cartons so an older sibling wouldn't find it and eat the last one before they got home from school. Another remembered eating an entire box in a single sitting, unable to stop once the first wrapper was open, describing it later as the best treat ever and swearing that nothing sold today comes close. A third, writing on the change.org petition years later, connected the bar directly to a parent who had since passed away, saying the taste still brought back the specific memory of buying them together at the store. Proof of just how deeply a $5 box of dessert could root itself into a family's private history. That kind of attachment didn't happen by accident. It happened because the bar occupied a very specific, very ordinary place in daily life. Not a treat reserved for special occasions, but a small, dependable comfort that showed up in the fridge week after week, the way a family might come to depend on a particular brand of orange juice or a favorite cereal. Parents packed it because it felt like a real dessert rather than a processed substitute. Kids ate it because it tasted like something a bakery would sell, minus the plate and the fork. And because it lived in the refrigerator rather than the pantry, it carried a subtle signal of freshness and quality that shelf-stable snack cakes simply couldn't match. Behind the scenes, the people responsible for getting that box into the refrigerated case were riding the same wave the shoppers felt at the register. Sales representatives calling on regional grocery chains found themselves negotiating for more refrigerated shelf space rather than defending the space they already had, a rare and welcome position for any snack brand to be in. Inside the plants producing the bars, workers were running lines built around a genuinely complicated task. Pressing a graham crust, layering a cream cheese filling, carving a clean groove down the center of each bar, and filling that groove with jam, all while keeping the product cold enough to hold its shape before it ever reached a store shelf. It was a level of precision that few snack products demanded, and for a few years the plant kept pace with a demand that only seemed to grow. What was it about a $5 box of refrigerated dessert that made an entire generation remember it so specifically, so many years later? Perhaps it was the fact that it never asked to be anything more than what it was: cold, sweet, and exactly the same every single time someone reached for it. That reliability, that sameness was the whole point. And it is precisely that kind of product, the one that never seems to change, the one a family simply assumes will always be there, that tends to be the most vulnerable when something starts going wrong, far away from the dairy case, deep inside the machinery that made it possible in the first place. By the early 2000s, what had started as a single flagship flavor, sitting quietly in the dairy case, had grown into something closer to a small product line, and the decision to push it there hadn't happened by accident. Inside Kraft, a product performing the way the Strawberry Cheesecake Bar was performing, didn't stay a regional experiment for long. Once early sales data came back strong from the initial test markets, the internal case for full national distribution wrote itself. Here was a refrigerated item outselling expectations in a category: snack desserts, where most new entries quietly failed within a year. The rollout decision moved quickly, backed by a sales team eager to expand shelf space while the momentum was still building, rather than wait and risk a competitor noticing the same gap in the market. Convincing individual grocery chains to commit real refrigerated shelf space, however, was its own negotiation. Cold case real estate was some of the most contested territory in any supermarket, fought over by yogurt brands, string cheese, pudding cups, and a growing list of healthy snack products, all competing for the same few feet of glass-doored shelving. Kraft's sales representatives made their case using something simple and hard to argue with: sell-through data. Wherever the bars had already launched, they were moving off the shelf faster than nearly anything else in that section of the case. Chains like Kroger, Safeway, and Winn-Dixie didn't need to be convinced the product was good. They needed to be convinced it would keep selling at that pace once it wasn't a novelty anymore, and the early numbers gave sales reps exactly the leverage they needed to secure permanent placement rather than a trial run. As distribution expanded from a handful of test markets into a genuinely national footprint, the flavor lineup expanded with it. The original Strawberry Cheesecake Bar was joined by a classic plain cheesecake flavor, a chocolate chip version finished with a chocolate drizzle, and eventually a white chocolate raspberry variant aimed at customers who wanted something slightly more indulgent. Each new flavor gave the sales team another reason to ask for more shelf facings, and each additional facing made the product line harder for a store to quietly drop later if demand ever slowed. It was smart, standard, grocery industry strategy, but it also meant the entire operation depended on a single, fairly intricate manufacturing process being replicated at a much larger scale than it had ever run before. That process was the part nobody standing at the refrigerator case ever had reason to think about. Producing a shelf-stable snack cake was mechanically simple: mix, bake, wrap, box, ship, done, with a shelf life measured in months. What Kraft was now scaling nationally was something else entirely: a refrigerated dessert requiring a pressed graham crust, a precisely dosed layer of cream cheese filling, a hand-adjacent process of carving a clean groove down the center of each bar, filling that groove with jam without letting it bleed into the crust, and finishing the whole thing with a white chocolate drizzle, all while keeping the product cold enough at every stage to hold its shape and stay food safe on its way to a truck, then a warehouse, then a store shelf hundreds of miles away. Running that sequence correctly for a regional test market in small batches was one challenge. Running it correctly, at speed, at national volume, with a shelf life measured in days rather than months, was an entirely different order of difficulty. And it was the exact kind of production complexity that tends to reveal its weaknesses only after a company has already committed to selling the product everywhere. There is little public record of the bar's changing recipe or formulation as distribution expanded. No evidence in fan communities or elsewhere that the strawberry filling was thinned out or the crust cheapened to hit a national price point. What did change was the sheer scale and precision the factory now had to sustain, week after week, across a growing list of regional distribution centers, each with its own delivery schedule and its own cold chain logistics to manage. For a product built on being cold, fresh tasting, and structurally delicate, that seam of jam had to stay exactly where it was put. National scale wasn't just a sales victory, it was a quietly mounting operational bet, one made by a sales division that had every reason to keep saying yes, and a production side of the business that was about to be asked to do something it had never fully proven it could do indefinitely. For now, though, none of that showed up anywhere a shopper could see it. The trucks kept arriving, the cold case stayed stocked, and the Strawberry Cheesecake Bar was about to enter the years when it wasn't just a good-selling item in the dairy case. It was about to become something closer to a fixture of American childhood itself. By the early 2000s, the Strawberry Cheesecake Bar had stopped being simply a good-selling item in the dairy case and had become something closer to a fixture. The kind of product a family didn't decide to buy so much as simply expected to find, week after week, in the same cold corner of the same grocery store. Distribution had reached nearly every major chain across the country by this point, and industry estimates placed the product in a meaningful share of American households with children. A level of penetration that put it in company with far more established snack brands that had been on shelves for decades rather than just a few years. For a refrigerated dessert item, that kind of reach was almost unheard of. Most cold case snack products stayed regional or niche, or eventually got squeezed out by yogurt and pudding brands with deeper marketing budgets. The Strawberry Cheesecake Bar had done the opposite. It had gone from a promising new item to something that felt, to an entire generation of kids, like it had simply always existed. Kraft leaned into that momentum with the packaging itself rather than a splashy television campaign. The box art told shoppers exactly what was inside before they ever peeled back a wrapper: a cut-open photograph of the bar, the strawberry seam glistening down the center, the white chocolate drizzle catching the light just so. In an era before every product needed a viral commercial or a celebrity endorsement to break through, that kind of straightforward, appetite-driven packaging did the marketing work on its own, sitting quietly in the cold case and doing exactly what it needed to do, making a tired parent or a hungry kid stop for half a second longer than they would have otherwise. Inside the plants producing the bars at full national volume, workers described those years later as the good ones: steady overtime, full production lines running 6 days a week, a product moving off the truck bay almost as fast as it could be loaded. Regional sales representatives, once fighting hard just to secure a single shelf facing in a new chain, now spent their calls negotiating for more space rather than defending what they already had, a shift that changes the entire tone of a sales job. It is one thing to convince a buyer to take a chance on an unproven item. It is another thing entirely to be the representative a buyer calls, asking whether more product is available because the current allocation keeps selling out before the next truck arrives. What made those years matter most, though, wasn't the sell-through numbers or the shelf space. It was what was happening at the kitchen table. Parents who had grown up without anything quite like the Strawberry Cheesecake Bar were now buying it for their own kids, and in doing so, were quietly handing down a new kind of family ritual, one built around a $5 box rather than a recipe passed through generations. A mother who discovered the bars in her 20s, in the early rush of the product's national rollout, was, by the early 2000s, the same mother packing them into her child's lunchbox without a second thought. The way her own mother might have packed a homemade dessert a generation earlier, the bar had, in a strange and specific way, skipped a step most food traditions take decades to complete. It went from novelty to inheritance in the space of a single childhood. That was the real cultural position the product occupied by its peak. Not a treat reserved for special occasions, but a cold, dependable constant, sitting in the same spot in the refrigerator door that a family could count on being there. It didn't need a jingle everyone could sing or a mascot with its own Saturday morning cartoon. Its presence was quieter than that, and in some ways more powerful for being so ordinary. It was simply there, the way milk was there, the way eggs were there, except it tasted like dessert, and nobody had to ask permission to open it. It would be easy, looking back from 20 years later, to rush past this moment and get straight to the part of the story where everything falls apart. But that would miss the entire point of what was lost. Before there was a discontinuation, before there was a petition with 51,000 signatures, before there was a single Reddit thread asking what happened, there was simply a foil-wrapped bar in a refrigerator door, waiting for someone to come home from school and peel it open. That ordinary, unremarkable reliability, the sense that it would simply always be there, was exactly what made its disappearance, when it finally came, feel less like a product being discontinued and more like something being quietly taken away. By the middle of its run, somewhere around 2002 and 2003, the first small signs of strain were showing up in places no shopper would ever think to look. They weren't showing up on the shelf. The cold case still looked the way it always had. Trays stocked, boxes face forward, the same cut-open photograph of the strawberry seam catching the light under fluorescent grocery lighting. If anything, the shelf looked healthier than ever, distribution wider than it had ever been. But inside the supply chain that kept that shelf stocked, a very particular kind of problem was quietly building. The sort that doesn't announce itself with an empty shelf. It announces itself first as a shipment that arrives a day late, or a batch that gets pulled before it ever leaves the plant, or a regional distribution center that has to substitute one flavor for another because the one that was ordered simply isn't ready. The core of the difficulty was never a secret to anyone who understood how the bars were actually made, even if it never made its way into a press release. A shelf-stable snack cake could be baked, wrapped, and boxed in a single continuous run, with a shelf life measured in months that gave a factory enormous room for error. The Strawberry Cheesecake Bar had no such margin. Each one required a pressed graham crust, a precisely dosed cream cheese filling, a groove cut cleanly down the center, that groove filled with jam without letting it bleed into the crust below, a white chocolate drizzle applied as a finishing step, and then immediate uninterrupted refrigeration from the moment it left the line to the moment it reached a customer's hands. At regional scale, in smaller batches, that sequence was manageable. At full national volume, with trucks now running cold chain deliveries to distribution centers across dozens of states, all needing product on a schedule measured in days rather than weeks, the same process had almost no room left to absorb a bad day, a broken piece of equipment, or a supplier delay. And bad days were becoming harder to avoid. The fresh strawberry filling at the center of the product's most popular flavor wasn't something that could simply be swapped for a shelf-stable substitute without shoppers noticing the difference, which meant the plant remained dependent on a fruit supply chain with its own seasonal pressures and its own capacity limits. A dependency that a plain, room-temperature snack cake never would have carried. A store manager in one mid-sized chain, interviewed years later for a regional trade publication, recalled a stretch of months where the strawberry variety in particular became noticeably harder to keep in stock compared to the plain and chocolate chip flavors, even as customer demand for it stayed the highest of the entire line. At the time, it read as nothing more than an ordinary supply hiccup, the kind every grocery buyer deals with dozens of times a year without a second thought. Nobody standing in that aisle in 2003 reaching past an empty spot on the shelf for a different flavor had any reason to suspect they were looking at the first visible symptom of a manufacturing process quietly buckling under its own success. Inside the plant itself, the picture looked more serious than it did from a distribution center 1,000 miles away. Line workers were being asked to hold the same level of precision, that clean, hand-adjacent groove down the center of each bar, that exact dose of jam, that consistent chocolate drizzle. At a production speed the line had never been designed to sustain long-term. Equipment built for a smaller, more careful process was now running longer hours to meet national demand, and the kind of small mechanical failures that are routine on any production line started to carry higher stakes, because there was no longer any slack in the schedule to absorb them. A missed shift, a jam depositor, a refrigeration unit running warmer than it should for even a few hours, meant an entire batch could be compromised in ways that were invisible on the outside of the box but very real on the inside of the plant. How long can a product built on delicate precision keep scaling to meet demand it was never engineered to handle before something has to give? That was the question sitting unspoken inside Kraft's production division by the early 2000s. Not a question anyone was asking out loud in a boardroom yet, but one the manufacturing side of the business was living with every single week, even as the sales side kept pushing for more. What makes this moment in the story genuinely difficult to pin down, even now, is how little of it was ever documented publicly at the time. There was no press release about supply chain strain, no trade publication piece about refrigerated snack cake manufacturing bottlenecks, nothing that gave outside observers a clear paper trail to follow. What exists instead is a scattering of secondhand recollections, a store manager's memory of uneven restocking, factory-adjacent accounts that surfaced years later on forums and blogs, and eventually a single on-record statement from a Kraft marketing director who would describe the entire episode in just a few words as challenges within manufacturing capabilities. At the time those cracks were forming, though, that vague, careful phrase didn't exist yet. All that existed was an occasional gap on a shelf, quietly widening one regional distribution hiccup at a time. and a growing distance between how well the product was selling and how reliably it could actually be made. Somewhere between 2004 and early 2005, the decisions that would end the Strawberry Cheesecake Bar were made, and almost none of them were made in a way the public would ever see clearly. This is the part of the story where speculation tends to take over, because the official record is so thin. What can be said with confidence is this: production challenges that had been building quietly for 2 years reached a point where they could no longer be absorbed by working around them. What cannot be said with confidence, because no court filing, no FDA notice, no news report from the period supports it, is that there was ever a formal, safety-driven recall in 2006. That version of the story circulates today mostly in comment sections and TikTok captions, passed along by fans trying to make sense of a silence that Kraft never filled. It is worth naming honestly because it has become part of how people remember this product, but it is a rumor, not a documented fact, and it deserves to be treated as exactly that. What is documented is narrower, and in its own way just as unsettling. The only on-record explanation Kraft has ever given came more than a decade after the bars vanished. When a blogger researching the product's disappearance reached Kraft's marketing director, Basak Ogus, directly, the response was brief. The bars were discontinued due to challenges within manufacturing capabilities. No further detail, no timeline, no acknowledgement of what those challenges actually were, whether they involve cost, equipment, food safety, supply, or some combination of all of it. For a company sitting on a product that customers were, by that point, openly begging to have back, 4 words, challenges within manufacturing capabilities, was the entirety of the public explanation Kraft ever chose to offer. That silence is itself a decision, and it's the one worth examining most closely because it is the only part of this story that is fully documented. Somewhere inside Kraft, in the space between a production division reporting that a national-scale cheesecake bar line could no longer reliably meet demand, and a sales division that had spent years building shelf space and household loyalty around exactly that product, someone had to choose what to tell the public. They chose to tell them nothing, no farewell announcement, no explanation printed anywhere a shopper would see it. The bars simply stopped arriving, region by region, until the shelf space that sales reps had fought so hard to win got quietly reassigned to something else. It is easy from the outside to read that silence as protective. A company deciding that admitting a manufacturing failure, whatever its true nature, was worse for a trusted household name like Philadelphia than simply letting a product fade without comment. Whether that reasoning ever happened in an actual room, with actual executives weighing actual risk to the brand, is not something the public record can confirm. What can be said is that Kraft had every incentive to avoid a headline connecting Philadelphia and manufacturing failure in the same sentence, given how central that cream cheese brand name was, and still is, to the company's identity in the dairy aisle. A quiet discontinuation protected the name. An explained one might not have. For the people whose jobs depended on that production line, the ending arrived with none of the ambiguity that surrounds the corporate decision-making above them. Line workers who had spent years perfecting the exact pressure needed to cut a clean groove down the center of each bar, who had learned to read a piece of equipment well enough to catch a problem before it ruined a batch, were the ones who felt the shift first and most directly: reduced hours, then reassignment, then, for some, a line that simply wasn't running anymore. Regional sales representatives who had spent the better part of 5 years building relationships with grocery buyers, earning back shelf space one strong sales quarter at a time, were handed the unglamorous job of explaining to those same buyers why a permanent fixture of their cold case was no longer available to reorder, often with little more explanation than the buyers themselves would eventually get from the public. There is no clear record of the specific moment insiders at Kraft understood the product was finished for good. No leaked memo or dated internal announcement that historians or fans have ever surfaced. What exists instead is the pattern visible from outside the company. A widening gap between demand and supply through 2003 and into 2004, a production side of the business that had likely known for some time that the manufacturing process could not keep scaling the way it had been asked to, and a public-facing silence that lasted in total for more than 15 years before anyone at Kraft said anything about it at all. What responsibility does a company carry toward customers who build a piece of their family life around a product when that company ultimately decides silence is easier than an explanation? It's a question without a clean answer, and Kraft never offered one. What the record shows plainly is a production problem serious enough to end a genuinely popular item, a decision to say nothing about it at the time, and years later, 4 careful words offered only because someone happened to ask. Whatever happened inside that plant in its final months, whatever the true nature of those manufacturing capabilities actually was, the company that made the bars chose, and continued choosing for over a decade, to let the silence speak for itself. The first outward sign that something had permanently changed came not from a headline or an announcement, but from an empty spot on a shelf that nobody could explain. Sometime in late 2004, in scattered stores across different regions, shoppers who had reached for the Strawberry Cheesecake Bar every week for years started finding the space where it used to sit occupied by something else. A yogurt brand expanding into an extra facing, a new pudding cup line, anything that could fill the gap left behind. There was no sign taped to the shelf, no note in the weekly circular. The product simply wasn't restocked, and then, a few weeks later, it wasn't ordered at all. For a company that had spent years building this item into a fixture, the absence of any formal announcement was almost stranger than the disappearance itself. Discontinuations of major grocery products, even quiet ones, usually leave some kind of trace. A trade press mention, a line in a quarterly earnings call, a farewell note from the brand. This one left almost nothing. The erasure did not happen everywhere at once, because distribution had always run through regional distribution centers rather than a single national switch that could be flipped overnight. Different parts of the country lost the product on different timelines. A family in the Midwest might have kept finding the bars into early 2005, while a family on the East Coast had already been searching for months. That staggered disappearance is part of why so many fans, looking back, remember the date differently. Some say 2004, some say 2005, and both are, in their own way, correct. It wasn't a single day, it was a slow fade, playing out store by store, region by region, until one day there simply weren't any regions left where the product still showed up. What makes this discontinuation different from a typical one is the complete absence of the two things that usually accompany a product's end: a stated reason and a defined final date. Most discontinued grocery items, even beloved ones, come with at least a whisper of explanation somewhere in the historical record. A note about declining sales, a mention in a company filing, something a trade journalist picked up on at the time. The Strawberry Cheesecake Bar had none of that. No press release, no line in a Kraft earnings report, no trade publication piece marking its exit. It simply stopped being manufactured, and the silence that followed lasted far longer than the product's entire life on the shelf had. Online, that silence didn't stay unnoticed for long. As internet forums and early social platforms grew through the mid to late 2000s, fans of the product began finding each other in places built exactly for this kind of shared confusion. Message boards, and later Reddit's r-nostalgia, where old photographs of the packaging kept resurfacing, prompting waves of recognition from people who had assumed for years that they were the only ones who remembered. The most visible organized effort came in 2017 when a woman started a change.org petition simply titled, "Bring Back Philadelphia Cheesecake Snack Bars." It read less like a marketing campaign and more like an open letter, asking Kraft directly why the product had been taken away and pleading for its return. Within a few years, that petition had gathered more than 51,000 signatures, an extraordinary number for a snack that had, by then, been gone for over a decade, and a number that made one thing clear: Whatever had gone wrong inside Kraft's production line, it had nothing to do with people no longer wanting the product. By the mid-2010s, that unanswered demand had spilled over from petitions into the kitchen. Home bakers began posting their own reconstructions, working from memory and instinct to recreate a graham cracker crust, a cream cheese filling, and that signature strawberry groove down the center. TikTok and YouTube videos of these copycat versions began drawing views far beyond what a homemade dessert clip would normally expect. Each one captioned with some version of the same plea that these bars had disappeared, that nothing on the market since had come close, and that this was the closest anyone could get to the original. One baker, working through her own version of the recipe, described the bars as one of the snacks that had simply never left her mind, decades after she last tasted one. Small specialty food makers eventually followed the same instinct commercially. A company called Nutty and Nostalgic began selling its own strawberry cheesecake bar, explicitly marketed as a tribute to the discontinued Kraft product, layering white chocolate and a cheesecake filling into something meant to summon the same memory. Proof that the demand had never disappeared. Only the supply. Through all of this, the petitions, the recreations, the years of public longing playing out across forums and video platforms, Kraft itself said almost nothing. The company didn't respond to the petition. It didn't acknowledge the recipe videos. For more than 15 years, the single largest consumer-driven campaign to bring back a discontinued product in its portfolio was met with total public silence from the company that made it. Even as the same brand name, Philadelphia, continued selling cream cheese in that exact refrigerated aisle every single day. That silence finally cracked, if only slightly, in 2021, when a blogger researching the product for a recipe website managed to get a direct response from Kraft's marketing director, Basak Ogus. The reply amounted to a single sentence: that the bars had been discontinued due to challenges within manufacturing capabilities, followed by a vague suggestion that improvements in production technology might someday make a return possible. It wasn't much. It didn't name what those challenges actually were, and it came 16 years after the last bar had left a shelf. But it was remarkably the only acknowledgement Kraft had ever given that the product's disappearance was worth explaining at all. Behind that one careful sentence sat an entire production line that had simply gone dark, and the people who had run it. Unlike the sales representatives and marketing teams who moved on to other brands within the same company, factory workers tied specifically to the cheesecake bar line faced a more direct reckoning. Reduced shifts, reassignment to other Kraft products running through the same plant, or, for some, the end of a job built around a very specific skill that no longer had anywhere to be used. There is no public accounting of exactly how many positions were affected or what became of the workers who had spent years learning to cut a clean, even groove down the center of a cold cream cheese bar, a skill that, as far as the historical record shows, no other product at Kraft ever called for again. They simply weren't there anymore, working a line that, as far as most of America knew, had never officially ended at all. She never got a clear answer, and neither did anyone else standing in that aisle around the same time. What existed instead, for years afterward, was a kind of second-hand marketplace that sprang up entirely on its own. As word spread that the bars weren't coming back, unopened boxes with distant expiration dates started surfacing on eBay and other resale sites, sold by shoppers who had stocked up without realizing they were buying the last cases their local store would ever receive. Prices for a $5 box of dessert climbed well past what anyone would normally pay for packaged food, driven entirely by scarcity rather than the product itself. A sign, if anyone inside Kraft had been paying attention, that the demand curve for this item had never actually bent downward the way a typical discontinuation would suggest. Food media, for its part, largely missed the moment entirely. There was no obituary written for the Strawberry Cheesecake Bar in 2004 or 2005, no trade publication marking its exit, no local news segment about a beloved snack disappearing from shelves. Coverage, when it eventually came, arrived a decade or more later, and not from traditional food journalism at all. It came from listicle sites and nostalgia blogs revisiting discontinued snacks of the 90s and 2000s, almost always grouping the bars alongside other vanished products rather than treating their loss as a story in its own right. The first piece of real, direct engagement from anyone connected to the brand wouldn't come until 2021, when that single email exchange with Kraft's marketing director finally gave fans something resembling an official acknowledgement. Everything before that, nearly 2 decades of it, was mourning conducted entirely by the public for a product the manufacturer itself never once publicly grieved. That gap between how much the product meant to the people who ate it and how little the company that made it ever said about its ending is, in its own way, the truest measure of what was lost. A product doesn't need a press release to matter. It doesn't need a farewell campaign or a final commercial to have shaped the small, ordinary rituals of thousands of households. It only needs to be there, reliably, for long enough that its absence registers as something more than a gap on a shelf. By that measure, the Strawberry Cheesecake Bar mattered enormously. Enough that people were still writing about it, baking it, and asking after it. More than 15 years after the last box left a truck, what the shelf looked like in the months after the bar stopped arriving tells its own quiet story. Where a foil-top tray with a photograph of glistening strawberry filling used to sit, something else eventually took its place. A new yogurt line, an expanded pudding cup selection, whatever the store's buyer decided could fill the space fastest. Shoppers adjusted, the way shoppers always do. They found other desserts, other snacks, other small rituals to replace the one that had disappeared. But adjustment is not the same as replacement, and for years afterward, a specific kind of grocery store moment kept repeating itself in kitchens across the country. Someone standing in the dairy aisle, scanning the shelf out of old habit, before remembering, all over again, that the thing they were looking for wasn't coming back. By the time Kraft's marketing director finally answered the question in 2021, the silence had already done its damage in a way no explanation could fully undo. 16 years is a long time for a company to say nothing about a product people never stopped asking for. It was long enough for the children who grew up eating those bars after school to become parents themselves, packing their own children's lunchboxes with something else entirely, unable to hand down the one small ritual they most wanted to share. The empty shelf had become, by then, less a retail fact and more a kind of inherited absence. Something an entire generation carried forward, half memory and half question, waiting far longer than it should have for an answer that, when it finally came, amounted to 4 careful words and nothing more. What was left behind once the shelf space had long since been reassigned and the trucks had stopped running that route altogether was not a company statement or a clean historical record. It was petitions. It was homemade recipes, endlessly refined. It was a small specialty brand trying to recreate a flavor memory it hadn't even created in the first place. And it was, underneath all of it, a simple, unresolved sense of loss. The kind that doesn't come from a scandal or a controversy, but from something ordinary and beloved being quietly taken away, with no one ever fully explaining why. What replaced the Strawberry Cheesecake Bar on the shelf was never one single product, but a slow scattering of substitutes that never quite added up to the same thing. Fiber One eventually introduced its own cheesecake bars, complete with a recognizable strawberry ribbon running through the center. Visually close enough that some fans initially mistook photos of it for the original returning, but the resemblance mostly ended at the packaging. Reviews on Amazon and elsewhere described the Fiber One version as noticeably drier, built around a lower-calorie formula that traded the dense, creamy texture of the original for something closer to a diet snack bar. It filled the same slot in the refrigerated case, but it never filled the same place in memory. The more meaningful revival didn't come from a major food company at all. It came from small independent makers who set out to reconstruct something they too had lost. Nutty and Nostalgic, a small specialty snack company, began producing its own version explicitly framed as a tribute, a cashew butter-based cheesecake bar layered with white chocolate, built specifically to chase the flavor memory of the discontinued Kraft product rather than to compete as its own original idea. Customer reviews on the company's own site captured the strange, specific standard people were measuring it against. Not whether it tasted good on its own terms, but whether it tasted like the bars from childhood. One reviewer noted it didn't quite match an authentic strawberry cheesecake, but that it absolutely tasted like the old snack bar, which for a product trying to resurrect a very particular memory was exactly the review it needed. Alongside these commercial attempts, an entire home recipe economy grew up around the gap Kraft left behind. Food bloggers and home bakers spent years publishing their own versions, working backward from memory and old photographs of the packaging to reverse engineer a graham cracker crust, a cream cheese filling, and that signature groove of strawberry jam down the center. Some of these recipes accumulated years of comments from people thanking the author for getting them close enough to satisfy a craving that had gone unanswered for over a decade. None of them, including the people who wrote them, ever claimed to have matched the original exactly. What they had built instead was a kind of folk archive, a scattered, unofficial record of a product that its own manufacturer had never bothered to document or explain. The broader lesson sitting underneath this story is one the packaged food industry has quietly relearned more than once. Popularity alone does not guarantee a product's survival if the manufacturing process behind it cannot scale as reliably as the demand for it does. The Strawberry Cheesecake Bar was never undone by changing tastes, a health trend competitor, or a rival brand doing it better. It was undone by its own construction, a refrigerated, multi-layered dessert with a delicate fruit filling built for careful, small-batch production, then pushed to national volume faster than its manufacturing process could comfortably sustain. For an industry that often treats consumer demand as the only variable worth solving for, this is a quieter kind of cautionary tale. Sometimes the thing people love most is also the hardest thing to keep making at scale. And no amount of customer loyalty can fix a production line that was never built to run that big for that long. There is little public record of what became of the specific plant or plants involved in production, and no clear account of a single town whose economy was visibly reshaped by the line's closure, the way a factory town might be gutted by a full plant shutdown. That absence of documentation is itself consistent with everything else about this story. A discontinuation handled so quietly on such a rolling regional timeline that it left almost no trace in local economic records the way a single, dramatic factory closure would have. What the workers who ran that specific line experienced and where they went afterward remains one more detail Kraft never chose to make public. What does it mean when a flavor disappears completely and nothing quite manages to replace it? Not a corporate substitute, not a small tribute maker, not even the most careful homemade recreation. Perhaps it means that some products are never really about the recipe at all. The Strawberry Cheesecake Bar cannot be fully rebuilt from a list of ingredients, because what people are actually chasing 20 years later isn't the taste alone. It's the version of themselves that first tasted it, standing at a kitchen counter, peeling back foil, with nowhere else they needed to be. Somewhere in a kitchen that hasn't changed much in 20 years, a refrigerator door opens, and for half a second, before the light even settles, the memory arrives whole. It is a foil wrapper, cold in the hand, resisting for just a moment before it gives way. It is the smell that rises the instant the wrapper opens, sweet and slightly tangy, cream cheese and sugar, and something faintly like a bakery case. It is the graham cracker crust, pressed firm enough to hold its shape but soft enough to give under a first bite. It is the seam of strawberry jam running straight down the center, not swirled in, not an afterthought, but placed there deliberately, so that every bite carried crust and cream and fruit together in exactly the same proportion as the last one. It is the white chocolate drizzle, faintly sweeter than the rest, catching just slightly on the back of the tongue. And it is the cold, that specific refrigerated cold that no cookie or candy bar could ever offer. The kind of cold that made it feel less like a snack and more like a small private dessert nobody had to ask permission to eat. That memory belongs to a very specific window of American childhood, the years between 1999 and roughly 2004, when a $5 box of refrigerated dessert bars sat in the same aisle as the milk and the eggs, waiting to be noticed by anyone who actually looked. It mattered because of what it quietly replaced. Cheesecake before this was a special occasion food, sliced at a birthday party, bought whole from a bakery counter, eaten slowly with company, requiring a fork and a plate, and usually a reason. This was none of that. It asked for nothing. No holiday, no celebration, no dishes to wash afterward. It only asked for a refrigerator and 5 free minutes. And in exchange, it gave an entire generation of families a small, dependable ritual that fit into an ordinary Tuesday as easily as it fit into a lunchbox on a Monday morning. That is what made its disappearance feel different from an ordinary discontinuation. Products get discontinued constantly. Flavors fall out of favor. Packaging gets redesigned. Entire brands quietly vanish from shelves without anyone much noticing. This was not that kind of loss. This was a product still being asked for, still being bought, still being hidden behind milk cartons by siblings hoping to protect the last one, right up until the day it simply stopped arriving. It disappeared not because people stopped wanting it, but because the very thing that made it special, that careful construction, that precise seam of jam, that delicate cold chain journey from plant to shelf, turned out to be the hardest part to keep doing at the scale success demanded. There is something almost unbearably human in that. The very qualities that make a thing worth loving are so often the same qualities that make it fragile. For more than 15 years, that loss sat mostly unacknowledged, not just by the people who missed the bars, but by the company that made them. No announcement, no explanation, just an empty spot on a shelf, and then, eventually, a memory that an entire generation carried quietly, waiting for someone, anyone, to confirm they hadn't imagined it. They were not imagining it. 51,000 signatures on a petition confirmed it. Years of home bakers working from nothing but memory and old photographs, patiently trying to rebuild something they couldn't quite let go of, confirmed it. A single brief sentence from a marketing director, offered 16 years too late, confirmed it too, even if it never gave the full story anyone deserved. This is not a story that ends with the product coming back, and it does not need to. What it deserves instead is to be remembered honestly and with the weight it earned. There were the food developers who first believed a cheesecake could be reinvented as something small enough to eat standing at a counter. There were the line workers who spent years learning to cut a single, clean groove down the center of a cold cream cheese bar, a specific skill that, as far as anyone can tell, no other product ever asked of them again. There were the regional sales representatives who fought for shelf space and later had to explain, with almost nothing to explain, why that space had gone quiet. And there were the parents standing in a grocery aisle sometime around 2004, reaching for a spot on the shelf that wasn't there anymore, with no way of knowing they were living through the last chapter of something their children would still be describing in loving detail 20 years later. Somewhere tonight, someone is peeling back foil that no longer exists, in a memory instead of a refrigerator, describing the exact taste to a child who will never get to try it. The child won't understand it fully, but they'll understand, from the way it's described, that something real and specific and quietly extraordinary once lived in an ordinary refrigerator door, and is gone now except for the people who still remember exactly how it tasted.